This is not just the story of a woman who went missing after a night out. It's the story of how a series of failures, small and large, combined to create a tragedy that didn't have to happen. Her name was Tess Richey. She was 22 years old, full of life, curious about the world, warm, shy, intelligent. On the surface, her story is about a violent crime, but underneath that is something colder. The complete absence of urgency, empathy, and accountability from those tasked with keeping people safe. When Tess walked into the Toronto night on November 25, 2017, she didn't know that danger was already watching her. She didn't know that within hours she would be dead, strangled, and left in a stairwell less than 150 feet from where she was last seen. And she didn't know that her disappearance would be dismissed, her case deprioritized, and the responsibility to find her would fall on the one person who should never have had to carry that burden alone: her mother. This is a story of neglect, of choices not made, of steps not taken, and of a daughter found, not by law enforcement, but by the one person who refused to give up. A mother who searched when no one else did. What happened to Tess Richey is horrifying, but how it was allowed to happen and how it was handled afterward is something that should shake a city to its core. It was a Friday night in Toronto's Church Wellesley Village, the city's vibrant LGBTQ+ district, a stretch of blocks pulsing with lights, drag shows, and energy. It was the kind of place where people could feel safe to be who they were. And on that night, Tess Richey was doing just that. She had only recently come out as gay. And this night out, a trip to see a drag show with a close friend, was part of a new chapter in her life. She was relaxed, laughing, free. Tess had traveled from her hometown to the city to visit friends and celebrate. She wasn't the kind of person to make scenes or draw attention. She was quiet, but joyful. Someone who made you feel at ease. She spent the night at Cruise and Tangos, one of the neighborhood's most popular clubs, surrounded by music, dancing, and community. Footage from that night would later show her smiling and moving through the crowd, completely unaware that this ordinary night was a... Sometime around 1:30 a.m., Tess and her friend left the club. They encountered a man along the way, someone neither of them had met before. His name was Kalen Schlatter, 21 years old, average build, forgettable appearance. But he had a presence, calm, calculated. He engaged with them easily. What seemed like a chance meeting was likely something far more deliberate. Her friend eventually called it a night and got into a cab, but Tess stayed behind with Schlatter. She had no way of knowing that she had just made the most dangerous decision of her life. The two walked together along quiet streets. Cameras captured them on various corners, moving east toward Dundonald Street. There was no sign of distress. Tess looked relaxed, but surveillance doesn't tell you everything. The cameras watched silently as the two eventually turned toward a vacant property under renovation. It was nearly 4 in the morning. At 3:57 a.m., they entered a side stairwell leading into the basement of the building. Schlatter had positioned himself behind her, leading her deeper into darkness. At 4:14 a.m., only one of them came back out. Tess Richey was never seen alive again. When Tess's family woke up that Saturday morning and couldn't reach her, concern began to grow quickly. Tess was not the kind of person who went radio silent. She was careful. She always checked in. Her sisters began calling friends. When no one had heard from her, her mother Christine got into her car and drove 4 hours from North Bay to downtown Toronto. She wasn't waiting for answers. She was coming to find them. The police were notified almost immediately. A missing persons report was filed, but there was no sense of urgency from authorities. The response was procedural. Her case wasn't treated as high risk. Officers made some phone calls, noted some details, but there was no physical search, no grid layout, no press briefing, no dogs, no aerial views, no canvassing. The official tone was neutral. They believed, perhaps, that Tess had simply wandered off. But her mother knew better. Christine began her own search. She walked the streets Tess had walked. She retraced her daughter's last known locations with nothing more than flyers and intuition. For days she searched alleyways, questioned business owners, and tried to get someone, anyone, to take the case more seriously. Days passed. Sunday, Monday, Tuesday. Still no action from police. Still no sign of Tess. And then came Wednesday, 5 days after she disappeared. Christine returned to Dundonald Street one more time, this time guided by something deeper than logic. She approached a narrow, cold stairwell she hadn't checked before. As she stepped down into the concrete enclosure behind the vacant house, she saw something. A shape, a figure, still. Tess was there, curled up, frozen, dead. Just 130 feet from the last location police had tracked her to on camera. She had been there the whole time. Officers had walked past this location. Investigators had stood nearby. They had missed her. Or worse, they had never looked. The stairwell was secluded, but not sealed off. Tess's body had been placed deliberately. Her purse was by her side. Her clothing had been disturbed. The autopsy revealed she had died from manual strangulation, a slow, deliberate process that required sustained force. She had fought back. There were marks on her hands, scratches, bruising. Her death had not been accidental. She had not simply passed out. She had been killed.
Forensic evidence told the rest of the story. DNA samples recovered from Tess's skin, under her fingernails, and from her clothing all pointed to a single match: Kaylin Schlatter, the man last seen with her, the man who had led her into the stairwell and walked away. His DNA was found on her inner thigh, suggesting an attempted or completed sexual assault.
Police traced his phone activity from that night. The timeline matched. Every movement confirmed what they already suspected. Schlatter had lured Tess into a secluded place, attacked her, killed her, and left her body in the open air. Then he went home and acted as though nothing had happened. He had no criminal record, no major red flags. He lived in the city and appeared to lead a normal life. But beneath the surface, something was deeply wrong. Multiple women later came forward, describing similar interactions with him. He had been seen hovering around clubs, following women down streets, lurking near closed venues. The behavior had been dismissed as odd, until now. By early February 2018, the case against him was complete. The physical evidence was overwhelming. The timeline was airtight. The behavior was predatory. Police arrested Schlatter at his home and charged him with first-degree murder. He showed no emotion, but the city did. As Kaylin Schlatter sat behind bars awaiting trial, the city of Toronto simmered with questions that refused to go away. This case wasn't just about a single crime anymore. It had become a symbol of systemic failure, of lives dismissed, of warnings ignored. People wanted accountability, but more than anything, they wanted justice for Tess Richey. The legal process moved slowly. Forensic results had to be cataloged, witnesses contacted, digital records combed over again and again. But the prosecution was building something rock solid, a case that would leave no room for ambiguity. They weren't dealing with a whodunit. They knew exactly who was responsible. The challenge wasn't proving that Schlatter had been with Tess. The evidence for that was overwhelming. The challenge was proving premeditation, proving intent, proving that this wasn't just a tragic accident, but a cold, calculated. In 2020, the trial began. From the moment it opened, the room was filled with heavy air, the kind of atmosphere that settles over courtrooms where grief has lingered too long. Tess's family was there every day, no longer searching the streets, but now searching for closure in testimony, exhibits, and timelines. The prosecution began their argument with the facts, the timeline of Tess's last movements, captured frame by frame on dozens of security cameras, the DNA found on her body, the autopsy, the condition of the stairwell, her injuries, her phone, the position of her purse, her final text message, the silence that followed. Every piece of the puzzle built the same picture. Schlatter had singled Tess out, followed her through the night, and when she was isolated, he struck. There were no witnesses to the killing, but the evidence, layered together, became a voice of its own. The defense tried to present a different image, that Tess had been intoxicated, that the encounter had been consensual, that perhaps she had died accidentally or of exposure. But that narrative collapsed under the weight of physical science. The bruising around her neck, the defensive wounds, the timeline, her blood alcohol level. For weeks, the trial moved forward, and with every day, the contrast between who Tess was and how she was treated by the system became more visible. Her body had gone undiscovered for 5 days, not because she was lost, but because those tasked with finding her never looked hard enough. That failure echoed through the walls of the courtroom. Eventually, the trial reached its final days. Jurors had sat through hours of testimony, seen photographs no one should have to see, heard technical details that couldn't be explained away, and finally, they were asked to decide. The verdict came down: guilty of first-degree murder. There was no outburst in the courtroom, no shouting, just silence. The kind of silence that's heavy and full and final. It wasn't relief, not exactly. It was acknowledgement that what happened to Tess was real, that the system may have failed to protect her, but it hadn't failed to recognize what had been done. Colin Schlatter was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole for 25 years. But no sentence, no verdict, no headline could undo what had been done.
The trial had ended. The verdict had been read. The man who took Tess Richey's life had been convicted and sentenced. But even as the justice system delivered its final decision, the questions that haunted the case refused to disappear. Because long before Colin Schlatter placed his hands on Tess Richey's neck, a chain of missed opportunities had already put her in danger. What happened to Tess wasn't just a tragedy, it was a brutal indictment of a system that hesitated, that delayed, that failed to act when it mattered most. The public began asking what the police had actually done in the days after Tess went missing. Why was there no physical search of the alley where her body would later be found? Why hadn't anyone followed up on the footage showing her walking east with a strange man? Why had her case not been flagged as high risk despite the fact she was a young woman alone in the early morning hours, with no contact for days? Why was it her mother, not police, who found her? The Toronto Police Service faced a wave of scrutiny. Officials issued statements acknowledging delays. There were references to procedural missteps. But for many watching from the outside, the response felt hollow. The facts spoke for themselves. Tess had died within reach of rescue, and the people with the resources and responsibility to help had overlooked her. Her body had been within a few paces of the sidewalk, behind a door anyone could have opened. It was not hidden, It was simply not searched for. 2 officers involved in the early investigation were later brought before a disciplinary tribunal. The hearings revealed what many had suspected, that the search for Tess Richey had not been prioritized, that leads were not followed, that resources were not deployed. In technical terms, it was a failure of protocol. In human terms, it was a failure of empathy. And for Tess's family, it was a heartbreak that would never fully heal. Outside the courtroom, the city itself seemed shaken. Posters of Tess remained on telephone poles and subway stops. Her name lingered in community vigils, in online forums, in late-night conversations between women sharing fears about safety, about walking home, about who might be watching. Tess had become more than a victim. She had become a symbol of what happens when people are treated as statistics instead of as lives. Her mother, Christine, refused to let that symbol fade into silence. She began pushing for changes in how missing persons cases were handled. She gave interviews, attended forums, shared her story again and again, not because she wanted to relive it, but because she knew someone else's daughter could be next. She understood, in the clearest possible terms, that time matters, that response matters, that hesitation, even for a few hours, can be the difference between life and death. Tess Richey's name began to appear in policy discussions, in review panels, in new proposals for how police should assess risk. Slowly, the case helped push reforms into motion. But for her family, none of it felt like enough. Because no law, no hearing, no headline could bring her back. They had buried a daughter, a sister, a soul full of light, and what remained was the chilling knowledge that her death had not only been violent, it had been avoidable. When the cameras left the courtroom, when the reporters moved on, and when the headlines faded into the background noise of a city that never stops, one thing remained. The memory of Tess Richey, not as a statistic, not as a cautionary tale, but as a real human being. A daughter, a sister, a friend, a young woman who had just begun to explore her place in the world, a life that should have stretched far beyond a single night in November. The tragedy of her story is not only that she died, but that she was left alone in death. For 5 days, her body lay undiscovered, not because it was hidden in some remote forest or abandoned warehouse, but because the stairwell where she was left was never checked. She was right there, waiting to be found. And that truth is what transformed Tess Richey's story into something bigger, something unbearable. Her legacy is built on the love of a mother who refused to accept silence, a woman who drove for hours and searched street by street until she found her child. That act alone shattered the myth that victims are always found by the system. It exposed how deeply flawed the response had been. It held up a mirror to law enforcement, and the reflection was brutal. In the years that followed, her name became more than a case file. Schools began discussing her story in social safety lectures. Women's rights organizations held candlelight vigils in her memory. Activists cited her case when calling for better resources for missing persons units. Tess's death opened conversations about who gets searched for, who gets believed, and how deeply ingrained certain failures are within institutions meant to protect. Her image, soft, quiet, warm, became a symbol. Not of weakness, but of vulnerability ignored. And that symbol reached far beyond Toronto. Across the country, and even beyond Canada, people heard her name and remembered the fear of walking alone at night, the silence that follows unanswered texts, the weight of being dismissed too quickly. Today, there are still questions, still pain, still a mother who wakes up every day knowing her daughter should still be here. But there is also power in remembering, power in refusing to forget, power in sharing her story, again and again, so that her name doesn't fade. Because Tess Richey mattered, not just in life, but in everything she left behind. And by telling her story, we make sure that silence never wins again. The Tess Richey case wasn't just a moment in the news. It was a turning point. A reminder that evil doesn't always wear a mask, and that negligence can be just as deadly as violence. It showed us that justice is never automatic, that love can be more powerful than procedure, and that sometimes the person who saves you is the one who never stopped looking. So if you walk away from this story with anything, let it be this: when systems fail, people must rise. And Tess's mother did. If Tess's story moved you, don't let it end here. Hit that like button to show your support, subscribe so you never miss another case we uncover, and share this video so her name and her story continue to be remembered. Because every view, every share, and every voice helps keep justice alive. Tess Richey mattered. Let's make sure the world never forgets.